Trifles, a play one act by Susan Glaspell. Characters: George Henderson, County Attorney; Henry Peters, Sheriff; Lewis Hale, a neighboring farmer; Mrs. Peters, Mrs. Hale. The kitchen in the now abandoned farmhouse of John Wright, a gloomy kitchen and left without having been put in order, and wash pans under the sink, a loaf of bread outside the bread box, a dish towel on the table. Other signs of incompleted work. At the rear, the outer door opens and the sheriff comes in, followed by the county attorney and the Hale. The sheriff and the Hale are men in middle life. The county attorney is a young man. All are much bundled up and go at once to the stove. They are followed by the two women. The sheriff's wife first. She is a slightly wiry woman, a thin, nervous face. Mrs. Hale is larger and would ordinarily be called more comfortable looking, but she is disturbed now and looks fearfully about as she enters. The women who have come in slowly and stand close together near the door. County Attorney, rubbing his hands. This feels good. Come up to the fire, ladies. Mrs. Peters, after taking a step toward. I'm not cold. Sheriff, unbuttoning his overcoat and stepping away from the stove as if to mark the beginning of official business. Now, Mr. Hale, before we move things about, you explain to Mr. Henderson just what you saw when you came here yesterday morning. County Attorney, by the way, has anything been moved or things just as left them yesterday? Sheriff, looking about. It's just the same. When it dropped below zero last night, I thought I'd better send Frank out this morning to make a fire for us. No use getting pneumonia with a big case on. But I told him not to touch anything except the stove. And you know, Frank? County Attorney. Somebody should have been left there yesterday. Sheriff. Oh, yesterday? When I had to send Frank to Morris Center for that man who went crazy? I want you to know that I had my hands full yesterday. I knew you could get back from Omaha by today, and as long as I went over everything here myself. County Attorney. Well, Mr. Hale, tell us what happened when you came here yesterday morning. Hale. Hurry! And I had started to town with a load of potatoes. We came along the road from the place as I go here, I said. I'm going to see if I can get John Wright to go in with me on a party telephone. I spoke to Wright about it once before, and he put me off, saying Fox talked too much anyway, and all he asked was peace and quiet. I guess you know about how much he talked himself, but I thought maybe I went to the house and talked about it before his wife. Though I said to Harry that I didn't know as what his wife wanted much difference to John. County Attorney. Let's talk about that later, Mr. Hale. I don't want to talk about that, but tell now. What happened when you got to the house? Hale. I didn't hear or say anything. I knocked at the door and still it was all quiet inside. I know they must be up. It was past 8 o'clock, so I knocked again, and I thought I hear somebody say, "Come in." I wasn't sure. I'm not sure yet, but I opened the door, this door, indicating the door but which the two men are still standing. And there, in that rocker, pointing to it, sat Mrs. Wright. They all looked at the rocker. County Attorney. What was she doing? Hale. She was rocking back and forth. She had her apron in her hand and was kind of pleating it. County Attorney. And how did she look? Hale. Well, she looked queer. County Attorney. How do you mean, where? Hale. Well, as if she didn't know what she was going to do next, and kind of done up. County Attorney. How did she seem to feel about your coming? Hale. Why? I don't think she minded. One way or other, she didn't pay attention that much. I said, how do Mrs. Wright? Is it cold in the eye? And she said, is it? And went on a kind of pleating at her apron. Well, I guess I was surprised. She didn't ask me to come up to the stove or sit down, but just sat there, not even look at me. So I said, I want to see John. And then she laughed. I guess you would call it a laugh. I thought Harry and the team outside, so I said a little sharp, can't I see John? No, she says, kind of adult-like. And he home? He home? Says I. Yes. Says she. He's home. Then why can't I see him? I asked her out of the patience, cause he's dead. Says she. Then why? I just nodded her head, not getting a bit excited, but rocking back and forth. Why? Where is he? Says, I not knowing how to say. She pointed upstairs like that, himself pointing to the room above. I got up with the idea of going up here, like up there. I walked from there to here. Then I says, why that did he die of? He died of a rope round his neck, says she, and just went on a pleating and her apron. Well, I went out and called Harry. I thought I might need help. We went upstairs and there he was lying. County Attorney. I think I'd rather have you go into that upstairs where you can point it all out. Just go now with the rest of the story. Hale. Well, my first thought was to get that rope off. It looked. Staffy's face twitches. But Harry, he went up to him and he said, no, he's dead all right and would better not touch anything. So we went back downstairs. She was still sitting that the same way. Has anybody been notified? I asked. No, said Shake unconcerned. Who did this, Mrs. Wright? Said Harry. He said it businesslike, and she stopped pleating of her apron. I don't know, she says. You don't know? Says Harry. No, says Shake. Weren't you sleeping in the bed with him? Says Harry. Yes, she. But it wasn't on the inside. Somebody slipped a rope round his neck and strangled him. And you didn't wake up? Says Harry. I didn't wake up, she said. After him, we must look as if we didn't see. How that could be for after a minute, she said. A sleep sound. Harry was going to ask her more questions, but I said, maybe we ought to let her tell her story first to the coroner or the sheriff. So, Harry went fast as he could to River's place, where there's a telephone. County Attorney. And what did Mrs. Wright do when she knew that you had gone for the coroner? Hale. She moved from the chair to this one over here, pointing to a small chair in the corner, and just sat there with her hands and held together and looking down. I got a feeling that I ought to make some conversation, so I said I had come in to see if John wanted to put in a telephone. And at that she started to laugh, and then she stopped and looked at me, scared. The county attorney, who has his notebook out, made a note. I don't know, maybe it wasn't scared. It would like to say it was. Soon Harry got back and then Dr. Lloyd came. And you, Mr. Peters, and so I guess that all I know that you don't. County attorney, looking around. I guess we'll go upstairs first and then out to the barn and around there. To the sheriff. You're convinced that there was nothing important here, nothing that would point to any motive. Sheriff. Nothing here but kitchen things. The county attorney, after again looking around the kitchens, opened the door of a cupboard closet. He gets up on a chair and looks on a shelf, Pull his hand away, sticky. County attorney. Here's a nice mess. The woman drew nearer. Mrs. Peters. To another woman. Oh, her fruit. It did freeze. To the lawyer. She worried about that when it turned so cold, she said the fire go out and her jars would break. Sheriff. Well, can you beat the woman? Held for murder and worrying about her preserves? County attorney. I guess before we thought she may have something more serious than preserves to worry about. Hale. Well, women are used to worrying over trifles. The two women move a little closer together. County attorney, with the gallantry of a young politician. And yet, for all their worries, that would do without the ladies? The woman do not unbend. He goes to the sink, take a dipper full of water from the pails and pouring into a basin. Washes his hands, start to wipe them on the rolled towel, turn it for a cleaner place. Dirty towels. Kick his foot against and the pans under the sink. Not much of a housekeeper, would you say, ladies? Mrs. Hale. Stiffy. There's a great deal of work to be done on a farm. County attorney. To be sure, and yet, with a little bow to her. I know there are some Dixon County farmhouses which do not have such roller towels. He gives it a pull to expose its length again. Mrs. Hale. Those towels get dirty awful quick. Men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be. County attorney. Ah, loyal to your sex, I see. But you and Mrs. Wright were neighbors. I suppose you were friends too. Mrs. Hale, shaking her head. I've not seen much of her of late years. I've not been in this house. It's more than a year. County attorney. And why was that? You didn't like her? Mrs. Hale. I like her all well enough. Farmers' wives have their handful. Mr. Henderson and then County attorney. Yes? Mrs. Hale, looking about. It never seemed a very cheerful place. County attorney. No, it's not cheerful. I shouldn't say she had the homemaking instinct. Mrs. Hale. Well, I don't know as Wright had either. County attorney. You mean that they didn't get on very well? Mrs. Hale. No, I don't mean anything, but I don't think a place be any cheerfuller for John's Wright's being in it. County attorney. I'd like to talk more of that a little later. I want to get the lay of things upstairs now. He goes to the left where 3 steps lead to a stair door. Sheriff. I suppose anything Mrs. Peters does be all right. She was to take in some clothes for her. You know, and a few little things we left in such a hurry yesterday. County attorney. Yes, but I would like to see what you take, Mrs. Peters, and keep an eye out for anything that might be used to us. Mrs. Peters. Yes, Mr. Henderson. The woman listened to the man's steps on the stairs, then looked about the kitchen. Mrs. Hale. I'd hate to have men coming into my kitchen, snooping around and criticizing. She arranged the pans on the sink which the lawyer had shoved out of place. Mrs. Peters. Of course, it's no more than their duty. Mrs. Hale. Duty all right, but I guess the deputy sheriff that came out to make the fire might have got a little of his own. Gives a roller tower a pull. Wish I'd thought of that sooner. Sims meant to talk about her for not having things slick up when she had to come away in such a hurry. Mrs. Peters, who has gone to a small table in the left rear corner of the room and lifted one end of the towel that covers a pan. She had she had bread set. Stand still. Mrs. Hale, eyes fixed on a loaf of bread beside a bread box which is on a low shelf at the other side of the room, moved slowly toward it. She was going to put this in there, picks up loaf, then abruptly drops it, in a manner of returning to familiar things. It is shame about her fruit. I wonder it's all gone. Get up in a chair and look. I think there's some here that's all right. Mrs. Peters? Yes, here, holding it toward the window. This is cherries too, looking again. I declare I believe that the only one gets down bottle in her hand, goes to the sink and wipes it off the outside. She feel an awful, but after all, her hard work in the hot weather, I remember the afternoon I put up my cherries last summer. She put the bottles on the big kitchen table, center of the room, with a sigh. It is about to sit down in a rocking chair. Before she is seated, realizes what chair is it. With a slow look at its step back the chair, which she has touched the rock back and forth. Mrs. Peters. Well, I must get those things from the front room closet. She goes to the door at the right, but after looking into the other room, steps back. You coming with me, Mrs. Hale? You could help me carry them. They go into the other room. Repairs Mrs. Peters carrying a dress and skirt. Mrs. Hale following with a pair of shoes. Mrs. Peters. My, it's cold in there. She puts the clothes on a big table and hurries to the stove. Mrs. Hale, examining the skirt. Right was close. I think maybe that was she kept so much to herself. She didn't even belong to the ladies' aid. I suppose she felt she couldn't do her part. And then you don't enjoy things when you feel shabby. She used to wear pretty clothes and be lively when she was Minnie Foster, one of the town girls singing in the choir. But that was 30 years ago. This all you was to take in? Mrs. Peters. She said she wanted an apron, fine thing to want, for there isn't much to get you dirty in jail. Goodness knows. But it's supposed just to make her feel more natural, she said. She was in the top drawer in this cupboard. Yes, here. And then here a little shawl that always hung behind the door. Opens there and looks. Yes, here it is. Quickly shut door leading upstairs. Mrs. Hale, abruptly moving toward her. Mrs. Peters? Mrs. Peters. Yes, Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Hale. Do you think she did it? Mrs. Peters, in a frightened voice. Oh, I don't know. Mrs. Hale. Well, I don't think she did, asking for an apron and her little shawl, worrying about her fruit. Mrs. Peters. Start to speak, glancing up where footsteps are heard in the room above, in a low voice. Mr. Peters says it looks bad for her. Mr. Henderson is awful sarcastic in speech, and he make fun of her saying she didn't wake up. Mrs. Hale. Well, I guess John Wright didn't wake when they were slipping that rope under his neck. Mrs. Peters. No, it's strange. I must have been done awful crafty and still. They say it was such a funny way to kill a man, rigging it all up like that. Mrs. Hale. That's just what Mr. Hale said. There was a gun in the house. He says that he can't understand. Mrs. Peters. Mr. Henderson said coming out that was needed for this case was motive, something to show anger or sudden feeling. Mrs. Hale, who is standing by the table. Well, I don't see any signs of anger around here. She put her hands on the dish towel which lies on the table, stand looking down at table, one half of which is clean, the other half messy. It wiped to here. Makes a move as if to finish work, then turns and look loaf of bread outside the bread box. Drop towels, in that voice of coming back to familiar things. Wonder how they are finding things upstairs. I hope she had a little more bread up there. You know, it's some kind of sneaking, looking her up in the town and coming out here and trying to get her own house to turn against her. Mrs. Peters. But Mrs. Hale, the law is the law. Mrs. Hale, I suppose, and buttoning her coat. Better loosen up your things, Mrs. Peters. You won't feel them when you go out. Mrs. Peters takes off her fur tippet, goes to hang it on a hook at the back of the room, stand looking at the under part of the small corner table. Mrs. Peters, she was piecing a quilt. She brings the large sewing basket and they look at the bright pieces. Mrs. Hale, it's a log cabin pattern. Pretty, isn't it? I wonder if she was going to quilt or just not it. Footsteps have been heard coming down the stairs. The sheriff enters, followed by Hale and county attorney. Sheriff, they wonder if she was going to quilt or just not it. The man laughed, the woman looked abashed. County attorney, rubbing his hands over the stove. Frank's fire didn't do much up there, did it? Well, let's go out to the barn and get that cleared up. The men go outside. Mrs. Hale, resentfully, I don't know, was there anything so strange or taken up? Our time with little things while we're waiting for them to get the evidence. She sits down at the big table, smoothing out a block with decision. I don't see it is anything to laugh about. Mrs. Peters. Of course, they got awful important things on their minds. Pull up a chair and joins Mrs. Hale at the table. Mrs. Hale, examining another black. Mrs. Peters, look at this one. Here, this is the one she was working on. And look at the sewing. All of the rest, it has been so nice and even. And look at this. It's all over the place. Why? It looked as if she didn't know what she was about. After she has said this, they look at each other, then start to glance back at the door. After an instant, Mrs. Hale has pulled out a knot and ripped the sewing. Mrs. Peters. Oh, what are you doing, Mrs. Hale? Mrs. Hale, mildly, just pulling out a stitch or two that not sewed very good. Threading a needle, bad sewing always made me fidgety. Mrs. Peters, nervously, I don't think we ought to touch things. Mrs. Hale, I'll just finish up this end, suddenly stopping and leaning forward. Mrs. Peters? Mrs. Peters. Yes, Mrs. Hale? Mrs. Hale, what do you suppose she was so nervous about? Mrs. Peters. Oh, I don't know. As she was nervous, I something so awful queer when I'm just tired. Mrs. Hale start to say something. Look at Mrs. Peters, then go on a sewing. Well, I must get these things wrapped up. They may be through sooner than we think. Putting apron and other things together. I wonder where I can find a piece of paper and string. Mrs. Hale, in that cupboard maybe? Mrs. Peters, looking in a cupboard. Why? Here's a bird cage. Hold it up. Then she have a bird. Mrs. Hale? Mrs. Hale, why? I don't know where she did or not. I've not been here for so long. There was a man around last year selling canaries cheap, but I don't know as she took or won. Maybe she did. She used to sing real pretty herself. Mrs. Peters, glancing around. Seems funny to think of a bird here, but she must have had one. Or why she have a cage? I wonder what happened to it. Mrs. Hale, I suppose maybe the cat got it. Mrs. Peters, no, she didn't have a cat. She's got that feeling some people have about cats being afraid of them. My cat got in her room and she was real upset and asked me to take it out. Mrs. Hale, my sister Bessie was like that. Query in it. Mrs. Peters, examining the cage. Why, look at this door. It's broke. One hinge in pulled apart. Mrs. Hale, looking too. Looks as if someone must have been raw with it. Mrs. Peter, why? Yes. She brings the cage forward and put it on the table. Mrs. Hale, I wish if they're going to find any evidence there may be about it, I don't like this place. Mrs. Peters, but I'm awful glad you came with me, Mrs. Hale. It would be a lonesome for me sitting here alone. Mrs. Hale, it would, wouldn't it? Dropping her sewing. But I tell you what I would do wish, Mrs. Peters. I wish I had come over sometime when she was here. I, looking around the room, wish I had. Mrs. Peters, but of course you were awful busy, Mrs. Hale. Your house and your children. Mrs. Hale, I could come. I stay away because I weren't cheerful, and that's why I ought to have come. I never liked this place. Maybe because it's down in a hollow and you don't see the road. I don't know what it is, but it's a lonesome place and always was. I wish I had come over to see Minnie Foster sometimes. I can see now. Shake her head. Mrs. Peters, well, you mustn't reapproach yourself, Mrs. Hale. Somehow we just don't see how it is with other folks until something comes up. Mrs. Hale, not having children make less work, but makes a quiet house, and right out to work all day, and no company he did come in. Did you know John Wright, Mrs. Peters? Mrs. Peters, not to know him. I've seen him in town. They say he was a good man. Mrs. Hale, yes, good. He didn't drink and kept his word as well as most. I guess, and I paid his debt, but he was a hard man. Mrs. Peters, just to pass the time of the day with him. Shivers, like a raw wind that get to the bone. Possess her, eye falling in a cage. I should think she was a wanted a bird, but what do you suppose went with it? Mrs. Peters, I don't know unless it got sick and died. She reaches over and swings the broken door. Swing it again, both women watch it. Mrs. Hale, you weren't raised around here, were you? Mrs. Peters shakes her head. And you didn't know her? Mrs. Peters, not till they brought her yesterday. Mrs. Hale, she come to think of it, she was kind of like a bird herself, real sweet and pretty, but kind of timid and fluttery. How she did change. Silence, then, as if struck by a happy thought and relieved to get back to everything. Tell you what, Mrs. Peters, why didn't you take the guilt in with you? It might take up her mind. Mrs. Peters, why? I think that's a real nice idea, Mrs. Hale. There couldn't possibly be any objection to it. Could there? Now, just what would I take? I wonder if her patches are here and her things. The look in the sewing basket. Mrs. Hale, here's some red. I expect this has got sewing things in it. Bring out a fancy box. What a pretty box. Looks like something somebody would give you. Maybe her scissors are here. Open box. Suddenly put her hands to her nose. Why, Mrs. Peters? Bend nearer, then turns her face away. There's something wrapped up in this piece of silk. Mrs. Peters, why? This isn't her scissors? Mrs. Hale, lifting the silk. Oh, Mrs. Peters, it's... Mrs. Peters bent closer. Mrs. Peter, it's the bird. Mrs. Hale, jumping up. But Mrs. Peters, look at it. Its neck. Look at its neck. It's all other side too. Mrs. Peters, somebody wrung its neck. Their eyes met. A look of growing comprehension, of horror. Steps are heard outside. Mrs. Hill slips back under gilt pieces and sinks into her chair. Enter Sheriff and County Attorney. Mrs. Peters rises. County Attorney. As one turning from serious thing to little pleasantries. Well, ladies, have you decided where she was going to kill or not it? Mrs. Peters. We think she was going to not it. County Attorney. Well, that's interesting, I'm sure. Seeing the bird cage. Has the bird flown? Mrs. Hale. Putting more quilt pieces over the backs. We think the cat got it. County Attorney. Preoccupied. Is there a cat? Mrs. Hale glances in a quick covered way of Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Peters. Well, not now. They're superstitious, you know. They leave. County Attorney. To Sheriff Peters continuing an interrupted conversation. No sign at all of anyone having come from the outside. Their own roof. Now let's go up and again and go over it piece by piece. They start upstairs. It would have been someone who knew just the. Mrs. Peters sits down. The two women sit there not looking at another, but as if peering into something at the same time, holding back. When they talk now, it is the manner of feeling their way over strange ground, as if afraid of what they are saying, but as if they cannot help saying it. Mrs. Hale. She liked the bird. She was going to bury it in that pretty box. Mrs. Peters, in a whisper. When I was a girl, my kitten, there was a boy took a hatch and before my eyes, and before I could get there, cover her face in an instant. And the hatch held me back. I would have. Catches herself, look upstairs where steps are heard, falters weakly. Hurt him. Mrs. Hale, with a slow look around her. I wonder how it would seem never to have had any children around. Pose. No, right. Wouldn't like the bird, a thing that sung. She used to sing. He killed that too. Mrs. Peters, moving uneasily. We don't know who killed the bird. Mrs. Hale. I know. John Wright. Mrs. Peters. It was an awful thing was done in this house that night. Mrs. Hale. Killing a man while he slept. Slipping a rope around his neck and choked the life out of him. Mrs. Hale. His neck? Choked the life out of him? Her hand goes out and rests of the bird cage. Mrs. Peters, with rising voice. We don't know who killed him. We don't know. Mrs. Hale, her own feeling not interrupted. If there's been years and years of nothing, then a bird to sing to you, it would be awful. Still, after bird was still. Mrs. Peters, something within her speaking. I know what stillness is. When we homesteaded in Dakota, my first baby died after he was 2 years old. And me with no other then. Mrs. Hale, moving. How soon do you suppose they'll be through, looking for the evidence? Mrs. Peters. I know what stillness is. Pulling herself back. The law has got to punish crimes, Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Hale, not as if answering that. I wish you seen Minnie Foster when she wore a white dress with blue ribbons and stood up in the choir and sang. I look around the room. Oh, I wish I'd come over here once in a while. That was a crime. That was a crime. Who's going to punish that? Mrs. Peters, looking upstairs. We mustn't take on. Mrs. Hale, I might have known she needed help. I know how things can be. For women, I tell you, it's queer. Mrs. Peters, we live close together and we live far apart. We all go through the same things. It's just different kind of the same things. Brushes her eye, noticing the bottle of fruit reaching out of it. If I was you, I wouldn't tell her. Her fruit was gone. Tell her it ain't. Tell her it's all right. Take this to prove it to her. She she may never know whether it was broke or not. Mrs. Peters takes the bottle and look about for something to rub in it. Takes petticoat from the clothes brought by the other room, very nervously begins winding this around the bottle in a false voice. My, it's a good thing the men couldn't hear us. Wouldn't they just laugh? Getting all stared all over little thing like a dead canary, as if that could have anything to do with wouldn't they laughed? The men are heard coming downstairs. Mrs. Hale, under her breath, maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. County Attorney, no, Peters, it's all perfectly clear except a reason for doing it. But you know, juries, when it comes to women, if there was some definite thing, something to show, something to make a story about, a thing would connect up with a strange way of doing it. The woman eyes met for instant. Enter Hale from outer door. Hale, well, I've got the team around. Pretty cold out there. County Attorney, I'm going to stay here a while by myself. To the sheriff, you can send Frank out for me, can you? I want to go over everything. I'm not satisfied that we can't do better. Sheriff, do you want to say Mrs. Peter is going to take in? The lawyer goes to the table, picks up the apron, and laughs. County Attorney, oh, I guess they're not very dangerous things. She, ladies help, pick out. Moves a few things about, disturbing the quilt pieces with which cover the backs, step back. No, Mrs. Peters doesn't need supervising. For that matter, a sheriff's wife is married to the law. Even think of that way, Mrs. Peters? Mrs. Peters. Not just that way. Sheriff, chuckling. Married to the law? Moves toward the other room. I just want you to come here in a minute, George. Wait to take a look at these windows. County Attorney, scoffingly. Oh, windows. Sheriff, we'll be right out, Mr. Hale. Hale goes outside. The sheriff follows the county attorney into the room. Then Mrs. Hale rises, hands tied together, looking intensely at Mrs. Peters, whose eye makes a slow turn, finally meeting Mrs. Hale. A moment Mrs. Hale holds her hand, then her own eyes point the way to where the box is concealed. Suddenly, Mrs. Peters throws back killed pieces and tries to put the box in the bag she is wearing. It is too big. She opens box, starts to take bird out, cannot touch it, goes to pieces, stand there helpless. Sound of a knob turning into the other room. Mrs. Hale snatches the box and put it in a pocket of her big coat. Enter county attorney and sheriff. County attorney, face chilly. Well, Henry, at least we found out that she was not going to kill it. She was going to. What is it call it, ladies? Mrs. Hale, her hands again her packet. We call it not, Mr. Henderson.